The perfectly manicured lawn of my parents' estate felt less like a garden and more like a stage set for a play where everyone knew the lines except me. I stood there, clutching a glass of lukewarm champagne, while the late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the faces of 100 relatives. They were all smiling, but there was something predatory in the way their eyes tracked my movements, a kind of collective anticipation that made the hair on the back of my arms stand up. It was my 26th birthday, a milestone that usually warrants genuine celebration, but the atmosphere here was thick with a tension I could not quite name. I had spent the last hour accepting hollow compliments and air kisses from aunts who had not spoken to me in a decade, and cousins who looked at me as if I were a specimen in a jar. My father, William, stood at the front of the gathering, near the marble fountain, his posture rigid and commanding. He waved me over with a gesture that looked welcoming to an outsider, but felt like a summons to a subordinate. As I approached him, his smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. Those eyes remained cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. He reached behind the podium he had set up for speeches and produced a heavy leather portfolio. It was a beautiful object, dark mahogany leather with gold stitching, the kind of accessory a serious business person would carry to close a $1 million deal. For a fleeting, foolish second, I allowed myself to believe it was a genuine gift, perhaps a gesture of respect for the career I had built on my own in the city. He handed it to me, and the weight of it surprised me. It felt dense, substantial, like it held something of immense value. I looked at my mother, Eleanor, who was standing a few feet away, sipping her drink with a look of supreme satisfaction plastered across her face. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, urging me to open it. My hands trembled slightly as I undid the clasp, the leather creaking in the sudden silence that had fallen over the yard. The 100 guests had stopped talking. The clinking of glasses ceased. They were watching me with a hunger that turned my stomach. I lifted the cover and saw a single sheet of thick, cream-coloured linen paper resting inside. It was not a deed to a house, nor was it a savings bond. It was an invoice. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the document, my mind struggling to process the absurdity of what I was seeing. The header bore my father's consulting firm logo, embossed in silver ink, making it look terrifyingly official. Below that, in bold, stark typography, was a total amount due that made my knees weak. $248,000. I blinked, sure that I was hallucinating, but the numbers remained fixed on the page. The itemized list below the total was a grotesque accounting of my entire existence. There were charges for room and board for 18 years, fees for clothing and essentials, costs for medical expenses, and a staggering sum for what was labelled as the private school differential. But the line that made bile rise in my throat was at the very bottom. It read simply, "Inconvenience fee, $8,000. The silence in the yard was no longer heavy. It was suffocating. I looked up at my father, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a tasteless joke. But his face was a mask of stone. He was not joking. He was presenting a bill for the crime of having been his child. Before I could form a sentence, before I could ask why or how he could do this, my sister Brooklyn stepped out from the crowd. She moved with the fluid, arrogant grace of someone who has never been told no in her entire life. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, and her face was twisted into a smirk of pure triumph. She extended her hand toward me, palm up, and demanded that I hand over the car keys immediately. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, declaring that the vehicle was no longer mine. I stared at her, confused, my grip tightening on the leather portfolio. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, and hissed that the car was in Dad's name, and since I was effectively being liquidated as a family asset, the car was being repossessed. I looked at the white sedan parked in the driveway, the car I had driven here, the car I used to get to work, and realized with a sinking heart that she was right. Technically, the title was still with my parents, a lingering string I had forgotten to cut. I dropped the keys into her open palm. Her fingers closed around them like a trap snapping shut. The humiliation was a physical blow, leaving me reeling, but they were not finished with me yet. The final strike was executed with military precision. From the cluster of guests near the buffet, a man cleared his throat and stepped forward, looking down at his polished shoes as if he found them suddenly fascinating. It was Gary, my boss. I had not even known he was invited. My parents must have reached out to him secretly, inviting him into their circle, dazzling him with their wealth and connections. Gary refused to meet my eyes as he mumbled that, in light of recent character references provided by my family, my position at the firm was no longer tenable. He told me I was fired, effective immediately. The words hung in the air, joining the invoice and the stolen keys in a trifecta of destruction. My father placed a hand on Gary's shoulder, a gesture of approval, as if Gary had just performed a difficult trick. I stood there, holding the bill for my own life, stripped of my transportation, my employment, and my family in the span of 5 minutes. I realized then that this was not a party. It was a public execution. It was an eraser designed to wipe me out of existence. They did not just want to cut me off, they wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would never be able to stand up again. I looked around the garden one last time. I saw the faces of my aunts and uncles, people I had known since birth, and saw no pity, only a morbid curiosity. They were enjoying the show. I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal sound of rage and betrayal, but I swallowed it down. I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. I would not cry. I would not beg. I straightened my spine, clutching the leather portfolio against my chest like a shield. I turned my back on my father, on my mother, on Brooklyn, and on the 100 witnesses to my demise. I did not say goodbye. I simply started walking. The sound of my heels clicking on the patio stones echoed in the silence, a lonely, rhythmic beat that marked the beginning of my exile. The driveway seemed impossibly long as I navigated it, lined on both sides with the luxury vehicles of the guests who had come to watch me fall. I passed my own car, the one Brooklyn had just claimed, and forced myself not to look at it. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, a collective heat that pricked at my skin. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They were waiting for me to crumble. They expected me to turn around at the gate, tears streaming down my face, and plead for a ride, plead for forgiveness, plead for the invoice to be taken back. They wanted my submission. That was the currency my parents traded in: control. If I walked away, I was rejecting their control, and that was the one thing they could not abide. I reached the massive iron gates of the estate, the metal cold under my fingertips as I pushed the pedestrian exit open. It clicked shut behind me with a heavy, final sound. It sounded like a prison door, but for the first time, I realized I was on the outside. They were the ones locked in. My apartment was 3 miles away. Under normal circumstances, a 3-mile walk is exercise. In high heels, nude pumps that were designed for sitting at a dinner table and looking elegant, it is a torture sentence. I looked down at my shoes. They were expensive, tight, and completely unsuited for asphalt. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, but I could not appreciate the view. I took the first step onto the main road, the uneven shoulder digging into my soles even through the shoes. The first mile was a blur of shock. My mind was a blank static, unable to form coherent thoughts. I just kept replaying the scene in the garden on a loop. My father's cold smile, the weight of the portfolio, Brooklyn's greedy fingers snatching the keys, Gary looking at the grass while he destroyed my career. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, a surreal distortion of reality. How could people who claimed to love you calculate the cost of your diapers? How could they charge you an inconvenience fee for your existence? By the second mile, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a sharp, biting physical pain. The heels were rubbing violently against the backs of my ankles with every step. I could feel the skin blistering, the friction creating a hot, stinging sensation that grew worse with every yard. I tried to adjust my gait, walking on the balls of my feet, but it only shifted the pain to my toes. A blister on my right heel popped, sending a jolt of agony up my leg that made me gasp. I stopped for a moment, leaning against a rusty street sign, and looked down. A small, dark spot of blood was blooming on the back of the nude leather shoe. I stared at it, the red contrasting with the pale shoe, and made a decision. I bent down and took them off. I held the shoes in my left hand, the portfolio in my right, and stepped onto the concrete barefoot. The pavement was rough, littered with small pebbles and debris, and it was still radiating the heat of the day. It scraped the soles of my feet instantly, but the pain was honest. It was real. The pain in my heart was too complex, too massive to understand yet, but the pain in my feet was simple. It grounded me. I continued walking, a barefoot woman in a cocktail dress, carrying a leather folder along the side of a busy road. Cars whizzed past me, the wind from their passing whipping my hair across my face. People slowed down to look, their faces pressed against the glass, gawking at the spectacle. They probably thought I was insane, a crazy woman who had lost her mind. Maybe I was. Or maybe, for the first time in 26 years, I was seeing things with absolute clarity. As the miles stretched on, the numbness in my brain began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard logic. I started to analyze the events of the evening. This was not an accident. This was not a fight that had spiraled out of control. You do not type up a professional invoice for $248,000 in the heat of the moment. You do not accidentally invite a boss to a birthday party just to fire an employee. This was a premeditated operation. They had sat down, likely over dinner with Brooklyn, and planned every detail. They picked the date, my birthday, for maximum emotional damage. They picked the venue, their garden, to showcase their power. They picked the audience to ensure my humiliation was public and irreversible. Why? The questions circled in my head, keeping time with my bleeding feet. Why would they do this? I had been a model daughter. I had never been arrested, never done drugs, never embarrassed them. I got straight A's. I graduated with honours. I got a prestigious job in data analytics. I never asked them for money. I was completely independent. And then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit me. That was the problem. My independence was the insult. My parents were narcissists of the highest order. To them, children were not people. They were extensions of themselves, props to be used for validation. When I was a child, I was useful because I was cute and obedient. But as an adult, I had failed them. I was not famous. I was not marrying a senator. I was not rich enough to buy them island vacations. I was just Maya, the data analyst who lived in a small apartment and paid her own bills. I did not need them, and because I did not need them, they could not control me. The realization fueled me, pushing me through the last mile. They hated that I was competent. They hated that I had built a life outside of their sphere of influence. My mother used to sigh when I talked about my work, dismissing it as boring computer stuff, while praising Brooklyn for her failed modeling gigs. Brooklyn was dependent. Brooklyn needed their money, their approval, their connections. Brooklyn was the perfect narcissistic supply. I, on the other hand, was a bad investment. They looked at me and saw a stock that had flatlined. They wanted their capital back. That was what the invoice was. It was a liquidation of a failed asset. They took the car to immobilize me. They took my job to bankrupt me. They wanted me to lose my apartment, to lose my ability to feed myself, so that I would have no choice but to crawl back to their house, begging for a room, begging for food. They wanted to reset the clock. They wanted me back in my old bedroom, under their roof, under their thumb, a slave to their whims. I finally reached my apartment building. My feet were black with dirt and smeared with blood. My legs were shaking so violently I had to grab the railing to pull myself up the front steps. I bypassed the elevator. I could not bear the thought of seeing a neighbour while I looked like a refugee from a high society war zone. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, leaving bloody footprints on the linoleum. When I reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, my house keys, the only keys I had left. I unlocked the door and stumbled inside. The air in my apartment was cool and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. It was a small space, nothing like the mansion I had just left, but it was mine. I paid the rent, I bought the furniture, I owned the silence here. I let the heavy leather portfolio drop from my hand. It hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. I did not go to the kitchen to get water, though my throat was parched. I did not go to the bathroom to wash my bleeding feet. I went straight to my desk. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, the mesh cool against my back, and opened my laptop. The screen came to life, casting a blue glow over my face, the only light in the darkening room. I typed in my password, my fingers flying across the keys with a muscle memory that felt comforting. I was not crying. I was not shaking anymore. A deep, icy cold had settled in the centre of my chest, a frozen void where my love for my family used to be. My father thought he was smart. He was a businessman of the old school. He dealt in handshakes, intimidation, and paper contracts. He thought power was shouting the loudest and having the biggest bank account. He did not understand my world. I am a data analyst. I understand patterns. I understand hidden variables. I understand how to find the things that people desperately want to keep hidden in the dark. I opened a terminal window. The black box appeared on the screen, the white cursor blinking rhythmically, waiting for my command. It looked like a heartbeat. "Okay," I said out loud, my voice raspy and strange in the empty room. "You want a war? We will have a war." They thought they had taken everything from me. My car, my job, my family, my dignity. But they had forgotten who I was. They forgot that for years I was the one who fixed their computers. I was the one who set up their networks. I was the one who secured their digital lives. They thought I was just their daughter, a pawn to be moved and discarded. They did not realize they had just declared war on a person who held the keys to their digital skeletons. I looked down at the portfolio on the floor. It lay there like a dead animal. Finally, I reached down and picked it up. The leather was smooth, smelling of my father's office, money and old cologne. I opened it again and took out the single sheet of paper. I read the list again, letting the anger crystallize into focus. Room and board, $180,000. Clothing, $25,000. Inconvenience fee, $8,000. The zeros swam before my eyes, but I forced them to stay still. The inconvenience fee hurt the most. Was that for the nights I cried as a baby? Was that for the times I got sick and ruined their dinner plans? I looked at the room and board line. I remembered my room in that big house. It was always cold. I was not allowed to put posters on the walls because it would ruin the paint. I was not allowed to keep the door closed because privacy was a privilege I had not earned. It wasn't a room, it was a storage unit where they kept me until I was needed for a photo op. I looked at the clothing charge. I remembered wearing Brooklyn's hand-me-downs my entire life. Brooklyn always got the new coats, the new boots, the designer jeans. I got what didn't fit her anymore, even if it was 3 sizes too big or the wrong colour. And now they were charging me $25,000 for the privilege of wearing my sister's cast-offs. I placed the paper on my desk next to my laptop. I felt sick, a physical nausea that roiled in my gut. But as I stared at the invoice, the sickness began to transform. It turned into clarity. This piece of paper was not a bill, it was a confession. Normal parents do not keep a tab. Normal parents do not calculate the cost of milk and diapers with compound interest. When you bring a child into the world, you sign an unwritten contract to care for them. That is the deal. You do not send a bill 18 years later. But my parents were not normal. They were transactional monsters. To them, I was an investment that had failed to yield a high enough return. They wanted their principal back. It made perfect sense now. The way they isolated me, the way they sabotaged me. They wanted to foreclose on their daughter. I whispered to the paper. I turned back to my computer. The cursor was still blinking, patient and ready. They had sent me a bill for $248,000, claiming I owed them for my life. But they had forgotten something crucial. I had access to things they did not know about. I knew where the real money was buried. I knew that their lifestyle was a house of cards built on secrets. I wasn't going to pay this invoice. I was going to audit them. I was going to dig through every digital transaction, every hidden account, every deleted email until I found the truth. I was going to send them an invoice of my own, and the currency I would demand was not dollars. It was their destruction. My phone had been buzzing relentlessly for 2 hours, vibrating on the desk like an angry insect. I glanced at the screen. Texts were flooding in from cousins, messages from friends who had heard the gossip, notifications from Instagram. Is it true you got fired? OMG, your dad is so mad. Saw Brooklyn's story, you okay? I did not open them. I did not reply. Silence is a wall, and I stayed firmly behind mine. But I could not stay silent about my job. That was the first pillar of my life they had tried to knock down, and I needed to shore it up immediately. My boss, Gary, the man who had fired me at the party, was a weak man. He was terrified of my father. My father was a big donor to the company's charity fund, and Gary probably thought firing me was a small price to pay to keep the donations flowing. Gary did not care about labour laws or fairness. He was a coward. If I called Gary, he would not listen. He would stutter and make excuses. I needed to go over his head. I needed to reach the top. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, watching the numbers shift from 9:29 to 9:30 at night. It was late, certainly too late for polite business calls, but I was well past the point of politeness. I searched my contacts for David Henderson, the regional director who sat 3 levels above Gary in the corporate hierarchy. 6 months ago, on a Sunday much like this one, our company had suffered a massive data breach attempt. I had been the only analyst logged in, the only one who noticed the server acting strangely. I had gone in, stopped the leak, and saved the company millions of dollars in potential lawsuits and lost data. David had called me personally the next day to thank me, giving me his personal cell number and telling me to use it if I ever needed anything. I hoped he meant it. My hands were steady as I dialed the number, though my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath, the silence of the room amplifying my anxiety. What if he didn't answer? What if he too was charmed by my father's money and influence? Then the line clicked open. David answered, his voice deep and slightly rough with fatigue, asking who was calling this late. I identified myself immediately, keeping my voice calm and professional, channeling that cold, icy feeling that had taken residence in my chest. He paused, recognizing my name, and asked if the server was down again. I told him the server was fine, but that I had a problem that required his immediate attention. I explained that I had just been terminated by Gary at a private party due to a personal dispute with my parents. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. David asked me to clarify, his tone sharpening. I told him the facts, stripping away the emotion. I explained that Gary was a guest at my parents' house, that my father was angry with me for personal reasons and that he had instructed Gary to fire me. I told him Gary had done it in front of 100 people. I did not mention the barefoot walk or the invoice. I stuck to the professional violation. I told him that I was one of his top analysts, that my performance reviews were perfect, and that I was being punished because my father was a donor. I concluded by saying that I respected the company and did not want to file a wrongful termination lawsuit, but I wanted to do my job. The threat of a lawsuit was subtle, wrapped in professional courtesy, but it landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. David did not hesitate. He told me to give him 10 minutes and to hang up so he could make a call. I put the phone down and the room fell silent again. Those 10 minutes felt like 10 years. I stared at the second hand on the wall clock, watching it tick slowly. This was the test. My parents had spent my entire life telling me I was nothing without them, that my success was only due to their name. My mother used to say I was only hired because I was a miller. I waited, wondering if she was right. 8 minutes later, my phone rang. It was David. His voice was hard like stone, the voice of a man who had just finished a very unpleasant conversation. He told me he had spoken to Gary. He said Gary had confirmed the story and admitted he acted under pressure from my father. David then delivered the news that made my breath catch. He said Gary was no longer the manager of my department. The termination was void. It never happened. I was still employed. But David was not finished. He told me that he was moving me to the senior security team immediately. I would report directly to headquarters, not the local branch. He said that Gary could not touch me, and more importantly, my parents could not touch me. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my relief so profound it made me dizzy. David continued, saying that they were adding a retention bonus and a 10% raise effective immediately because they did not like outside influence in their company. He apologized for what happened and told me he would see me on Monday. I thanked him and hung up. I sat back in my chair, a grim, tight smile stretching across my face. Strike one. My parents had tried to cut my income to make me destitute so I would crawl back. Instead, I got their friend fired. I got a promotion, and I got a raise. They thought I was weak. They thought I was the little girl who cried when she dropped her ice cream. They didn't know the woman I had become. They didn't know that while they were playing social games, I was building a career based on actual skill. I looked at the invoice again, the demand for $248,000 lying on my desk. They wanted money. I had just made more money, but I wasn't done. Reclaiming my job was just defense. I needed to go on the offensive. I turned back to the terminal window on my screen. It was time to audit the family finances. I was safe for now. I had my job and my salary. But that wasn't enough. My parents had attacked me. They had humiliated me. And most importantly, they had handed me an invoice claiming I owed them money. I needed to see if that was true. My father, William, was old-fashioned. He kept his passwords in a physical notebook in his desk drawer. I knew this because I used to play in his office as a kid, but I didn't need the physical notebook. 2 years ago, my father had asked me to set up his home Wi-Fi in his new computer because he was too cheap to hire a technician. He had barked at me to fix it, and I did. And while I was there, I set up a back door. I didn't do it to spy on him back then. I did it because I knew he would forget his password and blame me. I wanted a way to reset it remotely so he wouldn't yell at me. Now that back door was my weapon. I typed in the command to connect to the host IP address. A moment later, the text on the screen changed. Access granted. I was in his computer. It was almost insulting how easy it was. He didn't have two-factor authentication. He didn't have complex firewalls. He was arrogant. He thought no one would dare touch him, so he left his digital front door wide open. I navigated through his folders, my documents, finances, tax returns. I started opening files, feeling like a detective in a noir movie. But there was no jazz music, just the hum of my laptop fan and the pounding of my own heart. I looked at the bank statements first. My parents were rich, or at least they projected the image of being rich, but the numbers told a different story. They were bleeding cash. Country club fees, leasing payments for luxury cars, jewelry purchases. They were spending money as fast as it came in to maintain the illusion of importance. They were living paycheck to paycheck, just on a much higher scale than the average person. Then I found a folder labelled simply, quote, 7. My heart skipped a beat. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had passed away 5 years ago. Her name was Rose. She was the only one in that family who had ever shown me genuine affection. She used to sneak me cookies when my mother put me on a diet. She used to read to me when I was sick. When she died, there was a will. My parents told me she had left everything to them to manage for the family's benefit. I was 21 then, grieving and naive. I believed them. I didn't ask questions. I opened the file titled Grandma Rose Estate Distribution. I read the legal text, my eyes scanning the pages rapidly. Then I stopped. I stopped breathing. The text clearly stated that she bequeathed the sum of $500,000 to her granddaughter Maya. She had left $500,000 specifically to me, not to the family. It was to be held in trust until I reached the age of 21. I was 26. Where was the money? I started digging deeper, my fingers trembling with rage. I searched for the account number listed in the will. I traced the transfers. The money had been deposited into a separate trust account 5 years ago. Then, the withdrawals started. I saw a withdrawal for $50,000 transferred to William and Eleanor's joint checking account. I saw a withdrawal for $85,000 paid to a Mercedes-Benz dealership. I froze. The Mercedes. The white convertible Brooklyn drove. The one she bragged about constantly. She had told everyone, quote 9. He didn't buy it. I bought it. My grandmother's money, my inheritance, had paid for Brooklyn's car. I felt like I was going to throw up. The betrayal was physical, twisting my stomach into knots. It wasn't just that they were mean to me. It wasn't just that they ignored me. They were thieves. They had looked at a gift meant to secure my future and treated it like their own personal piggy bank. I kept looking, forcing myself to witness every theft. Withdrawal of $20,000 to a renovation contractor. That was for the new kitchen, the one I wasn't allowed to cook in because I might make a mess. Withdrawal of $10,000 for a vacation to Paris, the trip they took without me, leaving me home alone for Christmas. They had drained it, all of it. The current balance in the trust account was $4,512. They had stolen nearly $500,000 from their own daughter. They spent my inheritance on themselves and on Brooklyn, buying luxury and status with money that was supposed to keep me safe. And then, today, they had the audacity to hand me a bill for $248,000. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. It was evil. I sat back, shaking. Tears finally came, hot, angry tears that burned my cheeks. I wiped them away roughly. Grandma Rose wanted me to be safe. She knew my parents. She knew they wouldn't help me. That money was her protection from the grave, and they had violated it. I saved every file. I made copies of the bank logs, the will, the transfer receipts. I backed them up to a cloud server they couldn't touch. I had come home feeling like a victim, feeling small and erased. But now I was the most dangerous person in their lives. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to take back what was mine. But as I was saving the logs, I saw something else. Something strange in the transaction history of my father's business account. There were monthly transfers going out to an account I didn't recognize. $5,000 every single month. The recipient was listed as BS Lifestyle LLC. I frowned. I checked the incorporation documents for that LLC. The owner was listed as Brooklyn Scarlett, my sister. Wait. My parents said Brooklyn was finding herself. They said she was working on her modelling career, but the bank records showed regular, scheduled payments from my parents' business account to Brooklyn's shell company. And looking closer, the authorization for these transfers came from Brooklyn's user ID. She wasn't just receiving an allowance, she had access. I leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. Brooklyn wasn't just the spoiled golden child. She was an accomplice. I needed to see more. I needed to see exactly what my little sister was doing. I typed in a new command, diving deeper into the rabbit hole. I sat in the dark, my fatigue forgotten. I had found the stolen trust fund, which was the first crime, but the logs showed me something else, something active, something that was happening right now. I was looking at the transfers to BS Lifestyle LLC. $5,000 every month. That is $60,000 a year. My parents complained about money constantly. They said the market was bad. They said taxes were too high. So where did they find an extra $60,000 a year to send to a shell company? I traced the deposits coming into my parents' business account. I saw a pattern. Every month on the first day, a wire transfer came in from Kevin and Michelle Miller. The amount was exactly $5,000. The memo line read, Investment Fund, Tech Startups, Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle. My heart sank. Uncle Kevin was my father's younger brother. He was a kind, simple man. He wasn't smart with money, but he was good. He worked as a contractor, building houses, breaking his back carrying lumber. Aunt Michelle was a teacher who graded papers until midnight. They didn't have millions. They saved every penny they earned. I remembered a family barbecue last summer. Uncle Kevin was drinking a beer, looking happy and proud. He had told me. I felt sick. I looked at the bank logs again. The money came in from Kevin and Michelle on the first of the month. It stayed in my father's business account for exactly 24 hours. Then, on the second of the month, a transfer went out. To BS Lifestyle LLC. Amount $5,000. There were no tech startups. There were no investments. My father was taking his own brother's retirement money, washing it through his business account, and then sending it to Brooklyn. It was a Ponzi scheme, but without even the pretense of paying out returns. It was pure theft. I typed in the search command for BS Lifestyle LLC. I needed to see the spending. If this was a legitimate company, there should be business expenses, office rent, equipment, payroll. I cracked the password for the LLC's bank portal. It was Brooklyn 123. She was so lazy it was almost impressive. I opened the statements. Debit to Sephora, $450. Debit to Delta Airlines First Class, $1,200. Debit to the Ritz-Carlton, $3,000. Debit to Gucci, $800. It wasn't a business. It was a slush fund. Uncle Kevin was sweating on construction sites, ruining his back, trusting his big brother to secure his future. Aunt Michelle was working tirelessly in a classroom. They were sending that money to my father, believing in him. And my father was giving it to Brooklyn to buy purses and stay in five-star hotels. I felt a rage so hot it made my fingers tingle. This was worse than what they did to me. Stealing from me was one thing. I was young. I could work. I could recover. But Kevin and Michelle were in their 50s. This was their life savings. This was their security. But I needed to be absolutely sure about Brooklyn's role. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe my father just gave her a credit card and told her it was his money. Maybe she thought she was just spending her father's earnings. I looked at the authorization logs for the transfers. In banking, when you move money from a business account, you need a digital signature. I pulled up the log for last month's transfer. User ID BMILLER R2. IP address 192.168.1.55. The device name, Brooklyn's MacBook Pro. Action, authorized transfer. She knew. She wasn't just receiving the money passively, she was logging into the system. She was initiating the transfer from the business account to her LLC. She saw the source of the funds. The line item clearly said, quote 13, quote. She clicked approve. I sat back in my chair, the horror of it washing over me. I thought about Brooklyn at the party today. She looked so perfect, so innocent. Her hair was shiny, her skin glowing. She had demanded my car keys with a smirk, telling me it wasn't mine anymore. She played the part of the innocent, spoiled daughter perfectly. Everyone thought she was just dim, a pretty face who liked shopping. But she wasn't. She was a criminal. She was committing wire fraud. She was conspiring with my father to embezzle money from our relatives. She was looking at her uncle, the man who gave her birthday cards, the man who taught her how to ride a bike, and she was stealing his future to buy expensive makeup. She was worse than my parents. My parents were narcissists, yes, but Brooklyn was a sociopath. She felt nothing. I looked at the screen. I had everything. I had the chain of evidence, the trust fund theft, theft from me, the investment fraud, theft from Kevin and Michelle, the shell company, money laundering, the tax evasion. They definitely weren't declaring this as income. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. My feet were still throbbing from the walk, the dried blood stiff on my skin. But I felt awake. I felt powerful. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to make me zero. Instead, they had given me the keys to their destruction. I remembered the invoice they gave me. $248,000. I opened a calculator on my screen. My grandmother's trust? $500,000. Interest over 5 years, conservatively, $100,000. Uncle Kevin's stolen money over 4 years, $240,000. My car, which they took, $35,000. Total stolen, $875,000. And they had the nerve to ask me for money. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound in the quiet room, devoid of humour. I wasn't going to sue them. Lawsuits take years. Lawyers are expensive. My parents would drag it out, lie, charm the judge. No, I wasn't going to court. I was going to the family. My parents cared about one thing above all else, their image. They cared about what people thought. They cared about being the perfect family at the country club. They cared about being the rich, successful benefactors. If I sued them, they could spin it. They could say I was a crazy, ungrateful daughter. But if I showed the truth, if I showed the numbers, numbers don't lie. I started to organise the files. I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it, quote, 14. I dragged the PDF of the will into it. I dragged the bank statements into it. I dragged the logs of Brooklyn's shopping sprees into it. I dragged the email records into it. I was building a bomb, a digital bomb. I thought about Brooklyn again. I wondered if she was sleeping soundly in her silk sheets, dreaming about her next vacation. She had no idea that her life was about to end. She thought she was the main character. She thought I was just an extra. She was wrong. I clicked on the file for BS Lifestyle, LLC, one last time. I took a screenshot of the Approved button with her username next to it. Got you, I whispered. I was ready for the next step. The sun was coming up, turning the grey sky a lighter shade of slate. It looked like it was going to rain. It was fitting. I had the folder. Now I needed to package it. I opened a document editor. I didn't want to just send a bunch of loose files. People get confused by loose files. I wanted this to be a story a story they couldn't stop reading. I was going to write the most important report of my life. I created a single, comprehensive PDF document, treating it not as a collection of files, but as a narrative of betrayal that no one could ignore. I started with page 1, the cover page, typing the title in large, bold letters that dominated the white space. Family Audit, a financial review. It looked clinical, professional, and terrifyingly cold. On page 2, I wrote the introduction, keeping the language detached and factual. I stated that on the previous day, I had been presented with an invoice for $248,000 for the cost of my upbringing. I explained that this demand for payment had prompted me to conduct a full review of the family finances to ensure that all debts were accurately calculated and settled. Below that simple statement, I wrote that the following pages contained the results of that audit. It was the perfect setup. I was using their own logic against them. They wanted to treat our relationship as a business transaction? Fine. I would show them the balance sheet. Page 3 was dedicated to the Grandmother Rose Trust. I placed a high-resolution scan of the will on the left side of the page, highlighting the section where she explicitly left $500,000 to me in neon yellow. On the right side, I placed the bank transfer records showing the money leaving the trust account. I added a bright red arrow pointing from the withdrawal to the purchase receipt of the Mercedes-Benz dealership my father had bought 5 years ago. Underneath, I added a caption in bold text stating that the funds designated for Maya's education and future were misappropriated to acquire business assets for William Miller. I wanted there to be no ambiguity. I wanted every person who read this to see exactly where the money went. It wasn't lost, it was stolen. Page 4 was about the car. I included the purchase receipt for the white Mercedes convertible that Brooklyn drove, the one she had just reclaimed from me in the driveway. I highlighted the source of funds for that purchase. The money had come directly from the depleted trust account. I added a caption that read, "Purchased with funds embezzled from the Maya Miller Trust." It was a brutal juxtaposition. My sister was driving a car paid for by the grandmother who loved me, while I was walking barefoot on the side of the road. Page 5 was the hardest one to assemble because it involved Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle. I put the incoming transfer from Kevin's account on the left and the outgoing transfer to Brooklyn's shell company on the right. I placed them side by side so the flow of money was undeniable. I wrote a caption that made my hands shake as I typed it. Uncle Kevin's retirement savings are not invested in technology startups. They are transferred directly to Brooklyn Scarlett for personal use within 24 hours of receipt. Page 6 was a catalogue of Brooklyn's spending. I listed the purchases I'd found in the BS Lifestyle LLC account. The Gucci bags, the Ritz-Carlton stays, the first-class flights. I arranged them like a shopping catalogue. But instead of prices, I listed the dates they corresponded with Kevin's deposits. I captioned it, "How the Family Investment Fund is actually utilised." Page 7 was the conclusion. I wrote a summary of the debt. Total stolen from Maya, over $600,000 with interest. Total stolen from Kevin and Michelle, over $240,000. Total due to the family, $840,000. I concluded with a final sentence stating that my debt of $248,000 was considered paid in full, with a substantial credit remaining. I saved the file as _17_. It was 20 pages long. It was cold. It was factual. It was a nuclear bomb disguised as a spreadsheet. I opened my email client, the screen glowing brightly in the dark room. I took a sip of stale water and began to type in the recipients. I added my father, William Miller. I added my mother, Eleanor Miller. I carbon copied Brooklyn Scarlett. I carbon copied Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle. I carbon copied the estate lawyer who had handled Grandma Rose's will, a man who I knew would be terrified of a malpractice suit. And then I hesitated. My cursor hovered over the quote 18 button. I had one more group to add. The board of directors at my father's consulting firm. Sending this to the family would cause a civil war. Sending it to the board would destroy his career. It would end his professional life. It would strip him of his status, his income, and his identity. I looked at the invoice on my desk again, specifically at the line that read, quote, 19. He had charged me for the inconvenience of being his child. I typed in the group email address for the board of directors. I did not write a message in the body of the email. I did not write, quote 20 or quote 21 or explain my feelings. Anything I wrote would just look emotional. It would give them something to attack. They would say, quote 22 or quote 23. Silence is harder to argue with. The facts would speak for themselves. I attached the file. The progress bar moved across the screen, blue, steady, relentless. I felt a moment of sheer terror. Once I sent this, there was no going back. The family was over. Sundays were over. Holidays were over. I would be an orphan, effectively. But then I realised I was already an orphan. They had orphaned me yesterday in the garden. They orphaned me when they stole my grandmother's money. They orphaned me when they decided I was a balance sheet item, not a human being. This wasn't an attack. It was an autopsy. The body was already dead. I was just showing everyone the cause of death. I moved the mouse to the send button. My finger hovered over the plastic clicker. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of lemon cleaner and the metallic tang of fear. I whispered into the empty room. I clicked. The message swooshed away. Quote 25 appeared at the top of the screen. I closed the laptop immediately. I didn't want to see the read receipts. I didn't want to wait for the replies. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting for hours. I walked to the kitchen and poured another glass of water, drinking it in one long gulp. Then I went to my front door. I engaged the deadbolt. I engaged the chain lock. I went to the dining area, dragged a heavy wooden chair over to the door, and wedged it firmly under the handle. I knew what was coming next. The silence was the weapon, but the explosion was inevitable. I sat on my couch and wrapped a thick wool blanket around myself, shivering despite the warmth of the apartment. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Then my phone lit up on the coffee table. Incoming call. Dad. I watched it ring, the screen flashing his name like a warning light. I didn't touch it. It stopped, then immediately started again. Incoming call. Dad. Then, incoming call. Mum. Then, incoming call. Brooklyn. The phone buzzed and buzzed, dancing across the hard surface of the table with the intensity of their panic. Then the texts started flooding in. Maya, pick up the phone. Dad, what did you send? Mum, are you insane? You sent that to the board. Brooklyn, delete it right now. You're ruining everything. I watched the messages scroll by, a waterfall of desperation. They weren't sorry. They were scared. They were watching their lives disintegrate in real time. Then a different text came through. It was from Uncle Kevin. It was short, just 5 words. Quote 30. I picked up the phone for the first time. I typed one word. Quote 31. I put the phone back down. The war had started. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one running for cover. I was the one watching the fire burn. The noise didn't stop. For 3 hours, my phone vibrated constantly. It was like a living thing in the room, thrashing in its death throes. My father left voicemails. I listened to one of them, his voice distorted by rage and fear. He screamed that I needed to recall that email right now. He demanded I tell everyone it was a mistake, that I was hacked. He threatened to sue me for slander. He said he would ruin me. His voice was shaking. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. He knew that the bank logs didn't lie. He knew he couldn't sue for slander if it was the truth. Then my mother called. Her voicemail was different. She was crying, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. She called me sweetheart. She begged me to talk to them, saying we could fix this. She claimed they didn't mean to hurt me yesterday, that they were just stressed. She pleaded with me to think about the family. She told me to think about my sister. I deleted it immediately. That was always the line. I had to set myself on fire so Brooklyn could stay warm. Not anymore. I sat there in the dim light, watching the sunrise paint the walls grey, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I was the eye of the storm. Everything around me was chaos, but I was perfectly still. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite ring. It was a pounding fist on wood, violent and demanding. "Maya, open this door!" It was my father. I sat on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter. I didn't move. He kicked the door. The frame rattled and dust motes danced in the air. The chair I had wedged under the handle held firm. I stood up slowly, my bare feet silent on the floor. I walked to the door, but I didn't unlock it. I stood on the other side, separated by 2 inches of wood and a lifetime of disappointment. "Go away," I said. My voice was calm. It surprised me how steady it was. "Open the door!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The board called me. They're suspending me pending an investigation. Kevin is on his way over to my house with a lawyer. You have destroyed this family." "I didn't destroy it," I said through the wood, leaning my forehead against the cool surface. "I just turned on the lights." He slammed his fist against the door again. "You ungrateful little brat, after everything we gave you." "You gave me a bill," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Remember? $248,000. I just paid it." He went silent. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other side of the door, a ragged, desperate sound. "Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Please, just send an email saying it was a joke. I'll give you the money. I'll give you the $500,000. I'll buy you a car. Just fix it." He was trying to bribe me. He still thought everything was a transaction. He didn't understand that some things couldn't be bought. He didn't understand that trust, once broken, is gone forever. I looked down at the floor. I had printed something out before he arrived, anticipating this exact moment. It was a single sheet of paper. It was a printout from the Department of Justice website detailing the federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud and embezzlement. I slid the paper under the door. It made a soft scraping sound against the floorboards. He asked from the hallway. I heard the rustle of paper as he picked it up. I said. There was a long silence. I said. He asked, his voice trembling. I said, he sobbed. I heard a sound I had never heard before. It was a sob. My father, the strong, arrogant tyrant who had ruled our lives with an iron fist, was crying in the hallway of my cheap apartment building. He moaned. I said, my voice hard. It was a bluff. I had already decided I wouldn't go to the police unless I had to. The family knowing was enough punishment, but he didn't know that. I heard him shuffle away. His footsteps were heavy and slow, the sound of a man carrying the weight of his own ruin. I leaned my back against the door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I was shaking now. The adrenaline was leaving my body, leaving me weak and hollow. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Uncle Kevin. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. I stared at the screen, tears blurring my vision. That was the fear. That was the guilt I had been carrying since I clicked send. I thought I was the villain. I thought I was the one breaking things. But Kevin saw the truth. I walked back to the window and looked down at the street. I saw my father's car pulling away from the curb. It swerved a little, like a drunk driver was behind the wheel. He was gone. The panic was happening in their house now. The yelling, the blaming. Brooklyn screaming because her credit cards were getting declined. My mother crying because her social standing was vaporizing. But in my apartment, it was quiet. It was the first time in 26 years that I felt safe. But I knew this wasn't the end. The stone had been thrown, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. My father was desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. I needed to prepare for the fallout. I looked at the Quote 58 folder on my desktop. I wasn't done yet. There were still loose ends, and I had a feeling that Brooklyn wouldn't go down without a fight. The fall of the House of Miller did not happen all at once, like a building collapsing from a controlled demolition. Rather, it happened in agonizing slow motion, a painful dismantling that I watched from a safe distance. For the next 3 weeks, I became a spectator to the destruction of the life I had once desperately wanted to be a part of. I did not go to the house, and I did not answer the frantic calls that continued to come from blocked numbers. Instead, I received my updates from Uncle Kevin, who called me every evening with a heavy heart, and, surprisingly, from the local business news. The first domino to fall was my father's career, the very foundation upon which he had built his identity. 2 days after I sent the email to the board of directors, the news broke. My father was formally fired, stripped of his title as CEO, and removed from the board he had served on for 20 years. The irony was suffocating. The very same Quote 59 he had used to get me fired, his reputation, his standing, his name, were the things that came back to haunt him. The board made it clear in their public statement that they could not have a leader who was under investigation for embezzling funds from his own family members. It was a liability they could not afford. The morality clause in his contract, a clause he had often used to judge others, was the weapon that severed his professional head. Then came the lawsuits, a tidal wave of legal consequences that drowned their remaining hope. Uncle Kevin was a kind man, a man who hated conflict, but he was also a man who had been betrayed by his own flesh and blood. He did not want to sue, but his lawyer explained that it was the only way to recover the retirement money he and Aunt Michelle had spent a lifetime saving. He filed a civil suit against my father, against my mother, and against the BS Lifestyle LLC. Because the evidence I had provided was so overwhelming, the bank logs, the IP addresses, the digital signatures, the judge granted an emergency injunction. The court ordered an immediate freeze of all assets. I imagined the moment my mother tried to use her credit card at the grocery store or the hair salon, only to have it declined. I imagined the panic setting in as they realized that the liquid cash they relied on to maintain their facade was suddenly locked away behind a wall of legal red tape. They were trapped in their own house, surrounded by expensive things they could not eat and could not sell without court approval. The silence from their end stopped being a choice and became a necessity. They couldn't afford a lawyer to fight back, and the court-appointed defenders were advising them to stay quiet. I walked past the estate about 2 weeks later, drawn there by a morbid curiosity I couldn't quite suppress. I stayed on the other side of the street, hidden in the shadow of a large oak tree, watching the final act of their tragedy play out. There were moving trucks in the driveway, but they were not the luxury movers my parents would have hired. These were white, unmarked vans belonging to court-appointed liquidation teams. I watched as men in blue coveralls carried out the furniture piece by piece. I saw the antique mahogany dining table emerge from the front door, the table where I was not allowed to speak during dinner, the table that had witnessed years of silent judgment. It looked small and insignificant as they tilted it to fit through the doorframe. I saw the expensive silk sofas, the imported rugs, and the art from the walls being brought out into the sunlight. Stripped of the context of the mansion, stripped of the lighting and the pretension, it was just stuff. It was just wood and fabric and canvas. It held no power. It was being tagged with yellow stickers, inventoried, and loaded into the back of a dirty truck to be sold at auction to pay back the debts they owed to Uncle Kevin and to my trust fund. Then came the moment that felt like the true climax of the drama. A tow truck backed up to the 3-car garage, its reverse beeper cutting through the quiet afternoon air. The driver, a burly man who clearly didn't care about the pedigree of the people he was repossessing from, hooked up the white Mercedes convertible. It was Brooklyn's car, the symbol of her golden child status, the vehicle purchased with my grandmother's love. And then I saw Brooklyn. She ran out of the house, and for the first time in her life, she looked unraveled. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was messy and unwashed. She was wearing stained sweatpants and a t-shirt that looked too big for her. She ran toward the driver, screaming at him to stop. She yelled that he couldn't take it, that it was hers, that her daddy had bought it for her. The driver didn't even look at her. He just kept working the levers, the hydraulic whine of the lift drowning out her protests. The car lifted into the air, its white paint gleaming, mocking in the sun, dangling like a toy. "Daddy, do something!" Brooklyn shrieked, turning back toward the house. My father walked out onto the porch. He looked 20 years older than he had on my birthday. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. He was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, stripped of his suits and his armor. He looked at the scene with dead eyes. He didn't look at Brooklyn. He didn't look at the neighbors who were peeking through their curtains. He just watched the car go up. "It's gone, Brooklyn," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the lawn to where I stood. "But what am I supposed to drive?" she shrieked, stomping her foot like a toddler. "How am I supposed to go to brunch? How am I supposed to see my friends?" My father looked at her, and for a second, I saw a flash of realization in his eyes, a recognition of the monster he had created. "Take the bus," he said. He turned around and walked back into the empty house, closing the door on her screams. I almost laughed. The irony was perfect. The girl who had mocked me for walking was now a pedestrian in her own life. The BS Lifestyle LLC was dissolved within days. Brooklyn's brand died overnight, not with a bang, but with a humiliating whimper. When the news came out that she had been funding her influencer lifestyle by embezzling money from her working-class uncle, the internet turned on her with the ferocity that only the internet possesses. The comments on her posts shifted from adoration to vitriol instantly. "Thief! Fraud! Give back the money! My parents work harder than you ever will." She tried to delete the comments, but they came too fast. She tried to post a tearful apology video, claiming she didn't know where the money came from, but I had already released the logs showing her logging in and authorizing the transfers. The internet sleuths tore her apology apart, frame by frame. She deleted her account 3 days later. Without the money to buy followers, and without the social clout to get freebies, Brooklyn was nobody. She had no degree because she had dropped out. She had no work experience because she felt she was above it. She was 24 years old, with a criminal record pending, and a resume that was completely blank. I heard from Aunt Michelle a week later about Brooklyn's new reality. We were sitting in my small kitchen drinking tea, and Michelle looked 10 years younger now that the financial weight had been lifted. She told me that Brooklyn had gotten a job. "Really?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "Where?" Michelle smiled, a small, satisfied smile. "At the mall. At a clothing store." "Doing what?" I asked. "Folding shirts," Michelle said. She tried to apply for a management position, but she has no references and no degree. So she is working entry level, minimum wage. She has to wear a uniform. I nodded slowly, savouring the justice of it. Brooklyn, who had treated clothing as a disposable resource, who had mocked me for wearing her hand-me-downs, was now spending her days folding other people's clothes, standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, earning in a week what she used to spend on a single lunch. She was finally learning the value of $1, not through a lecture, but through the blisters on her feet. My parents had to sell the estate. It wasn't a choice, it was a mandate. After paying back the $240,000 to Uncle Kevin, paying back the $500,000 plus interest to my trust fund, and paying the exorbitant legal fees for their defense, they had almost nothing left. The equity in the house was the only thing that saved them from prison. Uncle Kevin had agreed to drop the criminal charges in exchange for full restitution, a mercy they did not deserve, but one he granted for the sake of the family name. They moved into a 2-bedroom condo on the other side of town, in a neighborhood that was respectable but far from elite. It was a normal apartment, no garden, no iron gates, no fountain, just a regular place for regular people. The social circle they loved so much evaporated like mist. The friends who came to the birthday party, the ones who drank their champagne and laughed at my humiliation, disappeared the moment the scandal broke. No one in that world wanted to be associated with embezzlers. My mother, who used to be the queen of the social scene, the woman who organised charity galas and judged everyone else's decor, was now a pariah. The silence that followed the chaos was profound. For the first time in my life, the noise of their expectations was gone. I sat in my apartment one evening, looking at the quote 76 folder on my computer. I had won. The victory was absolute. They had tried to destroy me, to bill me for my existence, and in return, I had dismantled their entire world. But as I sat there, I realised that the external war was over, but the internal one was still settling. I had expected to feel a rush of euphoria, a permanent high of triumph. Instead, I felt a quiet, heavy relief. It was the feeling of putting down a heavy backpack after a long hike. I wasn't happy that they were ruined. I was just glad that they could no longer hurt me. They were defanged. They were just people now. Flawed, broken, sad people who lived in a small condo and worried about electric bills. The monsters under the bed had been dragged out into the light, and in the light, they looked small. I received a letter from the bank confirming the deposit into my new account. The court-appointed trustee had transferred the full amount of the Grandma Rose Trust, plus the interest, plus a portion of the restitution from my parents' asset liquidation. I logged into my banking app and stared at the balance, $580,000. It was a staggering amount of money. It was enough to buy a house. It was enough to buy a fleet of Mercedes convertibles. But I didn't want any of that. I looked at the number and I didn't see luxury. I saw freedom. I saw a shield. This money meant I never had to tolerate disrespect from a boss because I needed the paycheck. It meant I never had to rely on a partner for financial security. It meant I could walk away from any situation that didn't serve me. I paid off my student loans in a single click. I paid off my small credit card debt. I put the rest into a diversified portfolio, ironically using the very investment strategies my father had lied about using for Uncle Kevin. But there was one final loose end. One final image I needed to process before I could truly close the book on the Miller family saga. I had seen my father defeated on the porch. I had seen Brooklyn screaming in the driveway, but I hadn't seen my mother. Eleanor Miller had been the architect of the emotional abuse, the one who whispered in my father's ear, the one who enforced the social hierarchy of the house. She had been invisible during the fallout, hiding behind closed doors, letting my father take the public shame. I needed to know if she had changed. I needed to know if the loss of her status had cracked the porcelain shell of her narcissism. I didn't want to talk to her, but I needed to see her. I needed to see if she was still the queen, or if she had finally become just Eleanor. I got my answer on a Tuesday evening in the most mundane place possible. I was at the grocery store picking up vegetables for dinner. I was standing in the produce aisle inspecting a bell pepper when I saw her. She was pushing her own cart. She was wearing a simple coat, not the fur she used to wear in the winter. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, lacking the professional blowout she used to get 3 times a week. She looked smaller, shrunken, as if the air had been let out of her. She was looking at a box of crackers, comparing the price of the name brand to the generic store brand. I watched her hand hover. The old Eleanor would have scoffed at the generic brand. The old Eleanor would have rather starved than be seen with a discount item. But this woman, this new version of my mother, put the expensive box back on the shelf and placed the generic box in her cart. It was a small gesture, a tiny moment of economic reality, but it hit me harder than the sight of the moving trucks. Then she turned and saw me. We locked eyes across a display of apples. I froze, my heart giving a single hard thump. I expected her to scream. I expected her to hiss at me, to blame me for her downfall, to make a scene right there in aisle 4. I braced myself for the venom. I straightened my spine, ready to defend myself. But the venom didn't come. Her eyes were wide and sad, filled with a mixture of fear and shame. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. She didn't see a disappointment. She didn't see a failed investment. She saw the woman who had bested her. She saw the daughter she had thrown away, standing strong and whole while she was broken. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, perhaps my name, perhaps an apology, perhaps a curse. But no sound came out. She looked down at the scuffed linoleum floor. She turned her cart around, her movements jerky and ungraceful, and walked away toward the frozen food section. I watched her go. I watched her retreating back, the slump of her shoulders, the way she kept her head down to avoid eye contact with anyone else. She was ashamed. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Miller felt shame. She wasn't angry. She was humiliated. And in that moment, the last lingering thread of fear I had for her snapped. She wasn't a monster. She was just a woman in a grocery store buying cheap crackers. She was a woman who had gambled her family for status and lost both. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I just felt nothing. A profound, peaceful nothingness. The cord was cut. I turned back to the bell peppers. I picked the best one, placed it in my basket, and walked toward the checkout. I had a dinner to cook. I had a life to live. And for the first time, the path ahead of me was completely clear, unobstructed by the debris of my past. It has been exactly 2 months since the night of the party, and the silence in my life has transformed from a terrifying void into a comforting symphony of peace. I still live in my small apartment in the city, the one with the linoleum floors and the view of the fire escape, and I have found that I love it more than ever. It is not a palace, but it is a fortress that I built with my own hands and paid for with my own money. The retention bonus from work hit my account last week, adding another layer of security to the foundation I am building. I also received the final disbursement from the trust fund recovery, and seeing that number on the screen, $500,000 plus the accumulated interest, did not make me feel like going on a shopping spree. I have not bought a Mercedes to replace the one Brooklyn flaunted. I have not bought designer clothes to mimic the socialites who used to look down on me. I paid off my student loans in full, watching the balance drop to zero with a satisfaction that was almost spiritual. I paid off my small credit card debt, and I put the rest away in a high-yield savings account that I have nicknamed the Freedom Fund. It sits there, quiet and growing, a silent guardian ensuring that I never have to depend on anyone ever again. I sit at my desk on a bright Saturday morning, the sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I open my laptop, the same machine that I used to dismantle my parents' empire, and the screen glows with a familiar blue light. The folder labelled, quote, 77, is still sitting on my desktop, a digital artifact of the war I fought and won. I open it one last time, scrolling through the files that changed everything. The invoice for $248,000, the bank logs showing the theft, the screenshots of Brooklyn's spending. It all feels like ancient history now, a story about a different person who was scared and seeking validation from people incapable of giving it. That Maya, the one who walked barefoot on the asphalt with bleeding feet, feels like a distant relative I once knew. I realize I don't need these files anymore. I don't need the proof of their crimes to validate my reality. I know who I am, and I know what they did. Keeping this folder feels like keeping a souvenir from a car crash. I select the folder and right-click to delete. A box pops up asking if I am sure I want to permanently delete quote 78, quote. I smile, a genuine, easy smile, and click yes. The folder disappears into the digital ether, and I feel a physical weight lift from my chest. I look out the window at the city waking up below me. I see people walking their dogs, couples holding hands, and the rhythm of life moving forward. I am alone in my apartment, but for the first time in my life, I am not lonely. I have discovered that family is not defined by whose DNA you carry, but by who stands beside you when the world falls apart. I have dinner with Uncle Kevin and Aunt Michelle every Sunday now. It has become a ritual that I cherish more than any gala or country club event my parents ever dragged me to. We cook together in their modest kitchen, chopping vegetables and roasting chicken while music plays on a small radio. We laugh until our sides hurt. They don't judge me for my job or my clothes. They don't send me invoices for the food I eat at their table. They just love me. Last Sunday, Uncle Kevin raised a glass of inexpensive wine and toasted to me, telling me that I saved them from a ruinous old age. I looked at him and Aunt Michelle, seeing the lines of worry that had vanished from their faces, and I realized that I had found my real parents. My biological parents in Brooklyn were just relatives, people I shared a genetic history with, but they were never my family. My phone buzzes on the desk, pulling me from my thoughts. It is a text from David, my boss at the firm. He is congratulating me on the security audit I completed this week, telling me that the team is lucky to have me and that headquarters is impressed with my thoroughness. I type back a thank you, feeling a warm glow of pride. I love my work. I love the logic of it, the way patterns emerge from chaos, the way I can protect things that matter. My parents had always looked down on my career, calling it boring and technical, because they couldn't understand anything that didn't involve social climbing. But this career is what saved me. My skills were the weapons I used to fight back. I am not just a miller anymore. I am a respected professional who earned her place at the table through competence, not nepotism. The irony is not lost on me that the very thing they despised, my independence and my intellect, was the thing that ultimately brought them down. They wanted a doll they could dress up and sell, and instead, they got a warrior who burned down the dollhouse. I stand up and stretch, feeling the strength in my legs. My feet have healed completely, the blisters and cuts from that long walk home now just faint pink scars that will fade with time. I walk to the mirror in the hallway and look at my reflection. I see a woman who is strong. I see a woman who walked through fire and came out the other side without burning. I am not a victim anymore. I am not the daughter of thieves. I am Maya. And for the first time in 26 years, that is enough. I don't need to be the good daughter. I don't need to be the quote 80. I just need to be myself. I think about the invoice one last time, the piece of paper that started it all. In a strange, twisted way, I am almost grateful for it. If they hadn't handed me that bill, if they hadn't pushed me that one step too far, I might have stayed in their orbit forever. I might have spent the next 20 years trying to please them, trying to earn a love that didn't exist. That invoice was the catalyst. It was the scissors that cut the cord. They thought they were charging me a debt, but they were actually handing me my freedom. I grab my keys from the bowl by the door. They are just regular keys, attached to a simple keychain, not the heavy status symbol fob of a luxury car. They belong to a reliable, used sedan I bought with my own money last week. It is a car that gets me from point A to point B. A car that no one can take away from me because my name is on the title. I walk out the door of my apartment and lock it behind me, the deadbolt sliding home with a satisfying click. I walk down the stairs, skipping the elevator, enjoying the movement of my body. When I step outside, the air is crisp and smells of autumn leaves and city rain. The sun is warm on my face. I have no destination in mind today. Maybe I will drive to the coast. Maybe I will go to a bookstore. Maybe I will just drive until the road ends. It doesn't matter where I go. What matters is that the steering wheel is in my hands, the gas tank is full, and the road ahead is wide open. I get into my car, start the engine, and pull out into traffic. I don't look back at the skyline where my parents' condo is located. I just look forward. I am free.